A rich man throws his newborn twins into the ocean, convinced they were stillborn. He never speaks of it again, burying the memory and his guilt deep beneath his success. But 22 years later, he gets a shocking call from two women who say just two words that stop his heart cold. It's us. How did they survive? Why have they come back now? And what will he do when he learns the truth about what really happened that night? This is a powerful story of grief, forgiveness, and the family we almost lose forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Mediterranean sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in ominous shades of gray as storm clouds gathered above the Celestia. Lawrence Gable stood at the helm of his luxury vessel, his weathered hands gripping the polished wooden wheel. The wind whipped his silver-streaked dark hair as he watched the waves grow increasingly volatile. Below deck, his wife Evelyn rested in their master suite, her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant with twins, she had insisted on one last voyage before becoming a mother. Lawrence had agreed, knowing how much the sea meant to them both. Now, as the vessel pitched and rolled beneath his feet, doubt gnawed at his conscience. "Mr. Gable." The ship's medic, Dr. Collins, burst onto the bridge, his young face flushed with urgency. "It's Mrs. Gable. She's gone into labor." Lawrence's heart clenched. "But it's too early," he said, even as he was already turning the wheel, signaling to his first mate to take over. "Radio for help." "The storm's interfering with communications, sir. We're trying, but—" A crack of thunder drowned out the rest of his words. Lawrence rushed past him, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The corridor seemed endless as he made his way to their cabin, his wife's pained cries growing louder with each step. Inside, he found Evelyn lying on their bed, her face contorted in agony. Her golden hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, her normally rosy complexion now ashen. "Lawrence," she gasped, reaching for him with trembling fingers. He took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "I'm here, my love. Everything will be fine." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Dr. Collins hurried in behind him, arms full of medical supplies. The young medic's hands shook as he laid out his equipment. Lawrence knew he was out of his depth. Collins was qualified for seasickness and minor injuries, not complicated deliveries. "The babies are coming now," Collins announced, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Gable, you'll need to push." The next hour passed in a blur of thunder, screams, and desperate prayers. The ship rolled violently, medical instruments clattering to the floor. Lawrence held Evelyn's hand through each contraction, whispering words of encouragement even as fear threatened to overwhelm him. The first baby arrived as lightning illuminated the cabin in harsh white light. Collins worked frantically, but something was wrong. There was too much blood. The second baby followed minutes later, but Evelyn's grip on Lawrence's hand was weakening. "Lawrence," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Love them. For me." "No," Lawrence pleaded. "Stay with me, darling. Please." But her eyes were already growing distant, her hand becoming limp in his. With one final soft exhale, Evelyn Gable slipped away from this world. Lawrence's anguished cry merged with a crash of thunder. He gathered his wife's body in his arms, rocking her gently as if she were merely sleeping. "Evelyn, my Evelyn." Behind him, Collins worked desperately with the newborns. The cabin had grown eerily quiet except for the medic's ragged breathing and the storm's continued rage. After what seemed like an eternity, Collins spoke, his voice hollow. "Mr. Gable, I'm so sorry. I can't find any signs of life. The babies, they're stillborn." Lawrence turned slowly, his world crumbling around him. The twins lay swaddled in white cloth, tiny and still. Collins stood back, his face pale and hands trembling. "The nearest port is hours away," the medic whispered. "In this storm, there's no help coming." Time seemed to stop in that moment. Lawrence felt himself moving as if in a dream, gathering the bundled infants in his arms. They were so small, so perfect. In his grief-stricken mind, a thought formed. They should be with their mother in the sea they both loved so much. The rain had momentarily subsided when Lawrence emerged on deck. The waves still churned below, but the worst of the storm had passed overhead. He walked to the stern, his precious burden cradled against his chest. With gentle reverence, he knelt and whispered a prayer into the salt-laden air. "Forgive what you do not know. May the sea carry you where I cannot." His vision blurred with tears as he lowered the white-wrapped bundles toward the dark waters. As the current caught them, one of the bundles shifted slightly, a tiny movement lost in the gathering dusk. But Lawrence had already turned away, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs as he retreated into the shadows of his vessel, leaving his heart behind in the depths of the Mediterranean. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a mournful farewell to the tiny souls being carried away by the tide, one of them still clinging to a thread of life that would forever change the course of many destinies. The Mediterranean dawn painted the sky in soft pastels, a stark contrast to the previous night's tempest. Gentle waves lapped against floating debris, remnants of the storm's fury scattered across the now peaceful surface. Among the driftwood and seaweed, a peculiar white bundle caught the morning light, bobbing slowly with the current. The storm-tossed cloth had somehow stayed wrapped around its precious cargo, though now soaked through with seawater. The twins, still bundled together, had become wedged against a large piece of driftwood, keeping them miraculously afloat through the night. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their mournful cries echoing across the empty expanse of blue. A weathered fishing trawler cut through the calm waters, its hull marked with years of salt and sun. The vessel, while appearing to be a simple fishing boat, carried a different cargo altogether. Below deck, dozens of migrants huddled in the darkness, hoping for a new life on European shores. Above, the crew of smugglers went about their morning routine, scanning the horizon for both opportunity and threat. Hassan, the youngest of the crew, stood at the bow with a pair of binoculars. His eyes caught something unusual, a flash of white against the blue waters. "Youssef," he called out, gesturing to the older man at the helm. "There's something in the water." Youssef, his face deeply lined from decades at sea, adjusted their course. As they drew closer, the white bundle became clearer. The entire crew gathered at the railings, pointing and muttering among themselves in Arabic. "It could be contraband," suggested Karim, his voice eager. "Maybe something worth salvaging." Youssef maneuvered the trawler alongside the floating bundle. Hassan leaned out with a boat hook, carefully drawing it closer. When he finally pulled it aboard, the crew fell silent. Water dripped from the white cloth as Hassan carefully unwrapped it, revealing two tiny faces. "Babies?" Karim stepped back, his expression darkening. "We should throw them back. They'll bring us bad luck." "Are they even alive?" another crew member asked, keeping his distance. Youssef pushed through the group, his weathered hands gentle as he checked the infants. To everyone's surprise, one of the babies made a weak sound. Then the other stirred slightly. "They live," he announced, his voice filled with wonder. "Allah has preserved them." Arguments broke out among the crew. Some, like Karim, insisted they should abandon the babies, claiming they couldn't risk the attention they might bring. Others saw it as an evil omen, speaking of spirits and curses. A few stood silent, torn between superstition and compassion. Youssef listened to them all, his ancient eyes fixed on the tiny faces before him. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his years. "I will not cast children back into the sea. Allah has placed them in our path for a reason." "The authorities," Karim began, "will not know." Youssef cut him off. "We deliver our usual cargo tonight. The babies will go ashore with the others." Despite continued grumbling, none dared to challenge Youssef directly. He was the oldest among them, and his word carried weight. He gathered the twins in his arms and disappeared below deck, returning minutes later with an empty wooden crate. He had lined it with an old tarp, creating a makeshift cradle. Throughout the day, Youssef tended to the infants between his duties. He fed them drops of warm water mixed with sugar, carefully warming their cold bodies. As the sun began to set, he sat beside their crate, humming an old Berber lullaby his mother had once sung to him. The melody drifted across the deck, mixing with the sound of waves against the hull. "Nami Nami Yazgiri," he sang softly, his rough voice gentled by the ancient words. "Sleep, sleep, my little one." The babies seemed to respond to his voice, their breathing becoming stronger as the hours passed. Night fell as the trawler approached the Sicilian coast. The crew worked in practiced silence, preparing for their clandestine landing. Youssef watched the monastery lights on the hillside, calculating their position. He knew the small dock below it well. It was secluded, rarely patrolled, and close enough to help. As the other smugglers began unloading their human cargo, Youssef gathered the crate containing the twins. He had wrapped them in dry blankets now, their original white swaddling clothes tucked beneath them. The babies were quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Youssef slipped away from the main group, carrying his precious burden up the weather-worn steps of the dock. The monastery bell tower loomed above, a dark shadow against the star-filled sky. At the top of the steps, he found the old bell rope, its bronze handle smooth from years of use. He set the crate down carefully in a sheltered corner of the dock. The twins stirred but didn't cry. Youssef touched each tiny forehead gently, whispering a blessing in Arabic. Then he grasped the bell rope and pulled it 3 times, the clear tones carrying through the night air. Without waiting to see who would answer, he melted into the shadows, his footsteps silent on the ancient stones. From his hiding place, he watched as a figure emerged from the monastery gates, a young nun moving quickly toward the dock. Sister Benedetta had been preparing for evening prayers when she heard the bell. Something about those 3 rings spoke of urgency, drawing her out into the night. Her flashlight beam swept across the dock until it illuminated the wooden crate. She approached cautiously, then gasped as she discovered its contents. 2 tiny babies lay inside, their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. They were cold, weak, but alive. Sister Benedetta quickly gathered the crate in her arms, her voice already rising in a call for help as she hurried back toward the monastery gates. Youssef watched until she disappeared inside with her precious burden. Only then did he turn away, making his way back to the trawler where his crew waited. The ancient lullaby still played in his mind as he boarded the vessel, a farewell to the 2 small lives Allah had placed in his path. The first rays of sunlight crept over the monastery's stone walls. As Sister Benedetta hurried through the ancient corridors, the wooden crate held close to her chest. Her footsteps echoed against the cold stone floors as she made her way to the infirmary, where oil lamps cast a warm glow in the dim morning light. Mother Silvana was already there, her lined face betraying no surprise at the early morning disturbance. The elderly nun's experienced hands moved swiftly as she helped Sister Benedetta place the crate on a worn wooden table. "They're so cold," Sister Benedetta whispered, her voice trembling as she touched one tiny hand. Mother Silvana's movements were precise and calm as she assessed the situation. "Build up the fire in the clay ovens," she instructed, her voice steady, "and bring clean linens, the softest we have." The infirmary soon hummed with quiet activity. Several nuns worked together, warming cloths near the ovens and wrapping the babies carefully. Mother Silvana prepared a mixture of warm goat's milk and honey, feeding each infant with steady hands and an eyedropper. "Slowly now," she murmured as one of the babies suckled weakly at the dropper. "There's time." Throughout that first day, the nuns took turns watching over the twins. They sang soft hymns and prayers, their voices mixing with the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore below. As evening approached, Mother Silvana gathered the sisters in the small chapel. "These children were brought to us by God's grace," she said, her voice firm. "We will care for them as our own." Sister Benedetta spoke up, her young face worried. "But surely we must report." "We will register them as found at sea," Mother Silvana interrupted gently. "Nothing more. Some questions are better left unasked." In the days that followed, the twins grew stronger. Mother Silvana watched them closely, noting how one seemed to sense the emotions of those around her, while the other observed everything with sharp, questioning eyes. "This one," she said, touching the more sensitive baby's cheek, "we will call Alma, for she carries the soul of others in her heart." She turned to the other infant, whose tiny fists were already clenched tight. And she shall be Ruth, for she will be a faithful companion to her sister. From a locked drawer in her office, Mother Silvana retrieved 2 silver lockets, old but well preserved. Each bore the same inscription, worn smooth by time: Ignoce quod nescis. She fastened them around the babies' necks, the metal warm against their skin. The years passed like pages turning in an ancient book. The monastery marked time with prayers and seasons, while the twins grew from infants to toddlers to young girls. Their presence brought new life to the old stones, their laughter echoing through corridors that had known only hymns and whispered prayers. At 2 years old, Alma's gift for sensing others' pain became clear. During a visit from a local woman suffering from arthritis, the toddler had crawled into her lap and placed her small hands on the woman's twisted fingers. She stayed there, quiet and still, until the woman's pain-lined face had softened. "She feels too much," Sister Benedetta worried to Mother Silvana. "It is her strength," the older nun replied, watching Alma comfort another child with a scraped knee, "though it will not always be easy for her." Ruth's protective nature emerged early and fiercely. At 5, she stood in the monastery's courtyard, her small frame planted firmly between her sister and 3 older children from the village, who had been teasing Alma about her quiet ways. "Leave her alone!" Ruth's voice rang out, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The bullies, surprised by her fierce defense, backed away. Mother Silvana, watching from a window, saw Ruth help Alma up and dust off her dress. The sisters walked away hand in hand, Ruth's protective stance never wavering. As the girls grew, their questions about their past became more frequent. They often sat on the monastery's seawall at sunset, their legs dangling over the edge as they watched the waves below. "Who was our mother?" 7-year-old Ruth asked one evening, her voice carrying a hint of the anger that would later define her. "Why didn't she want us?" Alma, always more accepting, squeezed her sister's hand. "Maybe she did want us," she said softly. "Maybe she couldn't keep us." Mother Silvana observed these conversations from a distance, her heart heavy with the weight of what she knew and what she didn't. She watched the girls grow, their personalities developing as distinctly as their matching faces. Ruth's questions became more pointed, her search for justice extending beyond their own story to every injured or wronged person she encountered. Alma's empathy deepened, her quiet presence bringing comfort to anyone in pain. Then came the day, just after their 10th birthday, when Ruth's searching nature led her to the monastery's cellar. The space was filled with old books, records, and maritime charts, remnants of the monastery's long history of offering sanctuary to those who came by sea. Ruth's sharp eyes caught the edge of a weathered chart poking out from beneath a stack of papers. She pulled it free carefully, spreading it on a dusty table. Her finger traced the coastline until it stopped at a familiar name: Marseille. Something stirred in her memory, a fragment of a dream perhaps, or a story half heard. That night, she slipped into the bed she shared with Alma, clutching the chart. "Look," she whispered, spreading the paper between them. The candlelight cast dancing shadows across the faded ink as she pointed to the name. "I think we came from here." Alma touched the chart with trembling fingers, her usual calm disturbed by the possibility of answers she wasn't sure she wanted. "How do you know?" "I just feel it," Ruth said, her voice fierce with conviction. "Like the sea is pulling us back there." Alma shivered, drawing closer to her sister. The locket around her neck seemed heavier suddenly, its inscription burning against her skin. "Forgive what you do not know." The morning sun painted the monastery's stone walls in soft gold as Alma and Ruth sat at a worn wooden table in the kitchen. Before them stood a simple cake, decorated with 18 carefully placed candles. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across their identical faces, though their expressions couldn't have been more different. Alma's eyes held their usual gentle warmth, while Ruth's burned with an intensity that had only grown stronger over the years. Sister Benedetta, now gray-haired but still quick on her feet, placed 2 cups of hot chocolate beside them. "Your favorite," she said softly, "just like when you were little." The twins exchanged knowing smiles. Every birthday had been marked with this same ritual: candles, chocolate, and the quiet presence of the nuns who had raised them. But this year felt different. Change hung in the air like morning mist, inevitable and slightly unsettling. "Make a wish," Mother Silvana said, her lined face betraying a hint of sadness she couldn't quite hide. The sisters leaned forward together, their long, dark hair falling forward in identical curtains. They blew out the candles in perfect synchronization, just as they had done every year before. The small gathering of nuns applauded softly, their habits rustling like autumn leaves. "I have something for you," Alma said to Ruth, reaching beneath the table. She pulled out a carefully wrapped package, tied with a simple blue ribbon. Ruth unwrapped it slowly, revealing a hand-stitched notebook bound in soft leather. The cover bore an intricate pattern of waves and stars that Alma had spent months perfecting. "For all your plans to change the world," Alma explained, her voice soft but sure, "every crusader needs a place to write their manifesto." Ruth ran her fingers over the stitching, touched by the hours of work represented in each careful line. "It's perfect," she whispered, then reached for her own gift to Alma. The package was oddly shaped, wrapped in brown paper and string. Alma unwrapped it carefully to reveal a wooden carving of a small boat, its details lovingly rendered by hand. "I found an old fisherman who teaches wood carving," Ruth explained. "Took me 3 tries to get it right." Alma lifted the boat, studying how the wood grain followed the curves of the hull. "It's beautiful," she said, her eyes growing misty. "Like the one in our dreams." The sisters shared a look of understanding. They had never spoken much about the dreams they both had, of rocking waves and distant thunder, of white cloth and salt spray. Some things were better left in the space between words. The weeks that followed their birthday passed in a blur of preparation and paperwork. Alma's acceptance to the nursing program in Palermo had come with a full scholarship from a church donor, a blessing that Mother Silvana had announced with quiet pride. Ruth's path had taken a different turn, sparked by an incident that had shaken the monastery's peaceful routine. A young woman named Fatima, who had sought sanctuary at the monastery, was taken away by immigration officials despite the nuns' protests. Ruth had watched, fists clenched and tears of rage streaming down her face as her friend was led away. That night she had stayed up late, filling out applications for law schools abroad by lamplight. "I'll learn how to stop this," she had told Alma, her voice hard with determination. "I'll learn how to protect people like Fatima." Now the sisters stood on the train platform in Palermo, their few possessions packed in worn suitcases. The morning crowd rushed around them, but they remained still, holding each other in a tight embrace that spoke of 18 years of shared breaths and heartbeats. "Remember to eat," Alma said, smoothing Ruth's collar with habitual care. "And don't stay up all night reading legal texts." Ruth managed a watery smile. "Remember to take care of yourself, not just everyone else," she countered. Then her expression hardened slightly. "If anyone ever finds out who left us there, I'll drag them to court. They'll answer for what they did." Alma touched her sister's cheek gently. "Maybe they were just broken," she said softly. "Like some of the people who come to the monastery, carrying pain we can't see." Ruth's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. They had had this conversation many times before, each sister holding to her own way of understanding their abandonment. "Write to me," Ruth said firmly. "Every week. Promise?" "Every week," Alma agreed. "I promise." The train whistle pierced the morning air, and they reluctantly separated. Ruth boarded first, her scholarship taking her to a university abroad. Alma would leave later that afternoon for her dormitory at the nursing school. They watched each other through the train window until distance made their faces indistinct. That night, in her small dormitory room, Alma carefully arranged her few possessions. She placed Ruth's carved boat on the windowsill where moonlight could catch its curves. Finally, she removed her locket and placed it on the nightstand, its worn inscription facing upward. The metal caught the light, making the words, "Ignoce quod nescis," seem to glow. Miles away in a cramped apartment shared with 2 other law students, Ruth stood at her window. The city lights below created a false horizon, so different from the sea view she had grown up with. She clutched her locket, running her thumb over the inscription as she had done countless times before. Someday we'll know, she whispered to the night air, her voice carrying all the determination that had driven her since childhood. Back at the monastery, Mother Silvana sat alone in her office. The letter had arrived that morning, bearing an official stamp and return address from a private investigator. The envelope, thick with possibility, bore a name she had hoped never to see: Lawrence Gable. Without opening it, she held the corner to the flame of her desk candle. The fire caught quickly, consuming the heavy paper. She watched until the name disappeared into ash, carrying its secrets with it. Only then did she bow her head and whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength to bear the weight of her choice. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Alma made her way through the palliative care ward of Palermo's San Matteo Hospital. Her white shoes barely made a sound on the polished floor, and her dark hair was neatly tied back, revealing a face that carried both youth and an old soul's wisdom in its gentle features. She paused at the nurse's station, checking her charts for the morning rounds. The familiar scent of disinfectant and coffee mingled in the air as Marta, a veteran nurse with laugh lines around her eyes, sidled up beside her. "There goes our guardian angel," Marta said, nudging Alma's shoulder. "Still walking on clouds instead of tile, I see." Alma smiled, used to her friend's teasing. "Someone has to balance out your tough love approach," she replied softly. Marta shook her head, her gray-streaked hair catching the harsh overhead light. "You're too gentle, cara mia. This job—" She made a gesture like something being crushed. "It eats you alive if you let it. 3 years I've watched you float through these halls like Mother Teresa herself, and I keep waiting for reality to catch up." "Maybe reality needs more gentleness," Alma said, organizing her supplies for the morning medication rounds. Her movements were precise but unhurried, each action carrying purpose without rushing. "Ha!" Marta exclaimed, but her eyes softened. "Just don't let them take advantage of that big heart of yours. Speaking of which, room 412 needs attention. The widow hasn't stopped crying since dawn." Alma nodded, already moving toward the room. Inside, she found Mrs. Conti hunched over her husband's bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The morning light through the window cast long shadows across the floor, making the scene feel like a painting of grief itself. Without speaking, Alma pulled up a chair beside the widow. She didn't immediately reach out or offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she sat in companionable silence, her presence steady and warm like a candle's flame. After a few minutes, Mrs. Conti's breathing steadied. She lifted her tear-stained face and whispered, "I don't know how to say goodbye." Alma reached out then, taking the older woman's hand in both of hers. "Sometimes we don't say goodbye," she said softly. "Sometimes we just hold all the love we have and let it be enough." The widow's fingers tightened around Alma's. "He always said I talked too much," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Maybe now is the time to just be quiet with him." They sat together as the morning light grew stronger, sharing the kind of silence that heals more than words ever could. When Dr. Leone passed by an hour later, he found Mrs. Conti sleeping peacefully in her chair, her hand still held gently in Alma's. Later that afternoon, Dr. Leone called Alma into his office. The room was cluttered with medical journals and family photos, giving it a lived-in feel that contrasted with the sterility of the hospital corridors. "That was impressive work with Mrs. Conti," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Not many nurses your age understand the power of presence over procedure." Alma settled into the chair, smoothing her uniform. "Sometimes people just need someone to witness their pain without trying to fix it." Dr. Leone nodded, picking up a folder from his desk. "Which is exactly why I'm recommending you for a special assignment." He opened the folder, scanning its contents. "We've received a request for home care, a VIP client who specifically asked for someone with discretion and compassion. The pay is excellent, and it would be exclusive care." "Home care?" Alma asked, tilting her head slightly. "I haven't done much of that." "But you have exactly what this case needs," Dr. Leone insisted. "Sometimes intuition matters more than experience. Would you be interested?" Alma considered for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I think I would. Excellent, I'll have the paperwork sent to you tomorrow. That evening, in her small apartment filled with potted herbs and secondhand furniture, Alma checked her email. Among the usual messages was one from Ruth, now in her final year of law school. The subject line read, "Look at this, world's smallest violin playing." Alma clicked open the attachment, a news article with the headline, "Shipping magnate Lawrence Gable diagnosed with terminal liver failure." The article detailed the business titan's recent withdrawal from public life and the uncertain future of his global shipping empire. She typed back a quick response, "Can't imagine a man like that needing help from people like us. How are your exams going?" The next morning, Alma sat at her kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window and warming her cup of chamomile tea. The assignment folder had arrived by courier, marked "Confidential" in red letters across the front. She took a sip of tea and opened the folder, scanning the first page. Her eyes stopped at the client's name, Lawrence Gable. She frowned slightly, remembering the article Ruth had sent, but the connection went no deeper than that casual recognition. Her fingers absently touched the locket that hung around her neck, a habit she'd developed over the years when deep in thought. After a moment's consideration, she closed the folder and began gathering her supplies for the new assignment. Whatever this wealthy man's story was, she would approach it as she did all her cases, with compassion and care. The morning light caught the edge of her locket as she moved about the apartment, the worn Latin inscription barely visible after all these years. Ignotia quod nescis. The words that had followed her from the sea to this moment, though their full significance remained as hidden as the truth of her origins. The morning fog clung to the coastal cliffs as Alma's taxi wound its way up the narrow road toward the Gable estate. Through the mist, the manor emerged like a ghost from another century, all weathered stone and tall windows that seemed to watch her approach. The Mediterranean spread out below, a steel-gray expanse that disappeared into the horizon. The driver pulled up to a set of wrought-iron gates that opened silently, as if expecting them. The driveway curved past unkempt gardens where winter had stripped the plants bare. Alma noticed how quiet it was. No gardeners, no outdoor staff, just the sound of gravel crunching under the taxi's tires. The manor's entrance loomed before her, massive wooden doors flanked by stone columns. Alma paid the driver and gathered her medical bag and small suitcase. Before she could knock, one of the doors creaked open. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. His face was lined with age and what looked like years of worry, but his posture remained perfectly straight. "Miss Alma Romano?" he asked, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone used to managing delicate situations. "Yes, that's me," she replied, adjusting the strap of her medical bag. "I'm Mr. Kellen, the house manager. Please come in." He stepped aside to let her enter. The foyer was dimly lit despite its size, with heavy curtains drawn across most of the windows. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor as Mr. Kellen led her through the space. Family portraits lined the walls, but they were too shadowed for Alma to make out the faces clearly. "The staff quarters are minimal these days," Mr. Kellen explained as they walked. "Just myself, the cook, and 2 housekeepers. Mr. Gable prefers privacy." He paused at the foot of a grand staircase, turning to face her. His expression was grave. "I should warn you. He doesn't like conversation. Just do what's needed. The less said, the better." Alma nodded, familiar with such requests from patients who preferred silence to forced cheerfulness. "I understand." Mr. Kellen led her up the stairs and down a long hallway. Medical equipment had been arranged discreetly along one wall, oxygen tanks, IV stands, and monitoring devices that seemed out of place among the antique furniture and thick carpets. "Mr. Gable is through here," Kellen said, stopping at a heavy oak door. He knocked once, then opened it without waiting for a response. The bedroom was large but felt oppressive, with dark wooden panels covering the walls and heavy drapes that let in only thin strips of daylight. Medical machines beeped softly in the corner, their modern presence jarring against the room's old-world atmosphere. Lawrence Gable lay propped up in a massive 4-poster bed, looking smaller than Alma had expected. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes were sunken but alert. Various tubes and monitoring wires connected him to the equipment beside the bed. "Mr. Gable," Kellen announced. "This is Nurse Romano." Gable's eyes fixed on Alma with unexpected intensity. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise? Recognition? But it vanished so quickly she thought she might have imagined it. "Get on with it, then," he said curtly, his voice rough from disuse. Alma moved forward with the quiet efficiency she'd developed over years of patient care. She checked his vital signs, examined the IV lines, and made notes on his chart. All the while, she could feel his gaze following her movements. The next few days fell into a routine. Alma worked quietly and methodically, speaking only when necessary about medical matters. She changed IVs, adjusted pillows, administered medications, and maintained a peaceful presence that seemed to slowly ease some of the tension in the room. By the third evening, she noticed small changes in Gable's behavior. He no longer turned his head away when she entered. Sometimes she caught him watching her with that same strange intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. During dinner on the fourth night, a simple soup she helped him eat, he broke his usual silence. "You look like someone I knew," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." Alma smiled gently, used to elderly patients seeing ghosts of their past in young faces. "Try to finish a bit more soup," she said softly, assuming it was just another medication-induced confusion. Later that night, after Gable had fallen asleep, Alma sat at the kitchen table to complete her daily notes. The old kitchen was warm and quiet, with copper pots hanging from the ceiling and the lingering smell of herbs from dinner. The window in front of her had turned into a black mirror in the darkness, reflecting her face as she worked. She paused in her writing, reaching for Gable's medical file to check something. As she flipped through the pages, a photograph slipped out and fell onto the table. It was old and slightly faded, its edges worn soft with age. Alma picked it up, curious. The image showed a young woman with dark eyes and high cheekbones, her smile bright and confident as she looked at the camera. The resemblance struck Alma like a physical shock. It was like looking at her own reflection in the window, but decades in the past. Her hands trembling slightly, she turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink was a simple caption: "Evelyn Gable, 1982. Alma's gaze darted between her reflection in the window and the photograph of Lawrence Gable's dead wife. The similarity was undeniable. The same dark eyes, the same high cheekbones, even the same way their hair fell across their foreheads. She sat there frozen, the medical notes forgotten, as the kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background. The weekend arrived with a restless wind that followed Alma all the way to Naples. She clutched her bag close as she navigated the busy streets, the photograph of Evelyn Gable safely tucked inside a folder. Ruth's law office sat wedged between a cafe and a bookshop, its narrow front decorated with a simple brass plaque bearing her name. Inside, the space was cramped but meticulously organized. Case files lined the walls in neat rows, and Ruth's desk dominated the small room. The window behind it offered a slice of Naples harbor, where fishing boats bobbed in the distance. Ruth looked up from her computer, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "This is a surprise," she said, standing to hug her sister. "I thought you were stuck at that fancy estate all weekend." "I asked for time off," Alma said, settling into the chair across from Ruth's desk. "I needed to show you something." Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew her twin's tones well enough to recognize when something was troubling her. "What's wrong?" Alma's hands trembled slightly as she opened her bag and pulled out the folder. "I found this in Mr. Gable's medical file." She placed the photograph of Evelyn on the desk between them. Do you think she looks like me?" Ruth picked up the photo, and her whole body went still. The coffee mug in her other hand froze halfway to her lips. Slowly, deliberately, she set both down and opened her desk drawer. From inside, she pulled out a weathered piece of paper, the old sea chart they'd found as children in the monastery's cellar. "I've kept this all these years," Ruth said, her voice tight with emotion. She spread the chart across her desk, smoothing out the familiar creases. I've studied it so many times, trying to piece together where we came from. Alma watched as Ruth's lawyer instincts took over. Her sister grabbed a pen and started marking points on the chart, muttering coordinates under her breath. She pulled up property records on her computer, cross-referencing addresses and locations. "The Gable estate," Ruth said, circling a spot on the chart. "It's here. And look, this marking shows where Evelyn Gable's yacht was reported to be in 2003. Her pen traced a line. "The week our mother died." The air seemed to thicken in the small office. Alma's hand went instinctively to her locket, fingers tracing the familiar Latin inscription. "Ruth," she said softly, "we don't know for certain." "Don't be naive, Alma." Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. She stood up, pacing the narrow space between the desk and the wall. "That man, if he's our father, he threw us into the sea. He dumped his own children into the Mediterranean like garbage." "We don't know what happened," Alma protested, trying to keep her voice calm. "Think about it. There could have been panic, shock. The medical records show there was only one undertrained medic on board. Maybe he truly thought we were—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ruth spun around, her eyes blazing. "Stop making excuses. Look at the evidence, the timing, the location, the fact that you're practically Evelyn's twin." She jabbed a finger at the photograph. "He had a choice, Alma. He chose to get rid of us. But what if he was overcome with grief? His wife had just died. The medic said we weren't breathing. So that makes it okay?" Ruth slammed her hands on the desk, making the coffee mug rattle. "He didn't even try to save us. He just wrapped us up and tossed us away." "Ruth, please, no!" Ruth grabbed her coat from the back of her chair. "I've spent my whole life defending people who were thrown away by others who should have protected them. I won't let you excuse this." She stormed toward the door, then turned back, her face flushed with anger. "That man doesn't deserve your compassion, Alma. He doesn't deserve anything from us." The door slammed behind her, leaving Alma alone in the small office. Through the window, she could see Ruth striding away, her dark hair whipping in the wind. The photograph of Evelyn still lay on the desk, the woman's smile unchanged by the tension that had filled the room. The next day, Alma returned to the Gable estate with her mind heavy and her heart torn. The familiar routine of patient care helped steady her nerves, checking vitals, adjusting medications, ensuring Lawrence Gable was comfortable. He seemed more withdrawn than usual, barely acknowledging her presence. That evening, after her duties were complete, Alma found herself wandering the dark hallways of the manor. The house creaked with age around her, and shadows danced on the walls from the dim sconces. Her footsteps led her to a hallway she hadn't explored before, lined with heavy wooden cabinets. One cabinet door stood slightly ajar, catching her attention. Inside, she found a large antique globe mounted on an ornate stand. The brass sphere was dulled with dust, its contents faded with age. Something about the base seemed odd. It was wider than necessary, with a slight gap where it met the floor. Curious, Alma ran her fingers along the edge of the stand. Her nail caught on a hidden seam, and a small panel popped open. The hollow space inside held a single folded paper, its edges yellow with age. With trembling fingers, she carefully unfolded it. It was a blueprint, detailed and precise, showing the deck plans of a yacht. At the top, in elegant script, was the name, the Celestia. Near the bottom, someone had circled a location in red ink, Marseille. Alma's heart pounded as she stared at the blueprint. The evidence seemed to be mounting, each discovery adding weight to Ruth's accusations. Before she could think too long about what she was doing, she slipped the blueprint into her bag and carefully closed the cabinet. The globe continued its silent vigil in the darkness as she walked away, its dusty surface reflecting the dim hallway lights like distant stars on an ocean long ago. The change in Lawrence Gable's condition came suddenly, like a storm breaking over calm waters. His coughs grew deeper, rattling through his chest with increasing violence. The machines beside his bed beeped more frequently, their steady rhythms replaced by erratic patterns that matched his declining health. Alma noticed the shift during her evening rounds. Lawrence's skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. She adjusted his pillows and checked his vital signs, recording each troubling number in her medical log. "The pain," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's worse tonight." She administered his prescribed medication through the IV, her movements gentle and precise. "Try to rest, Mr. Gable. I'll stay close by." The night grew darker, and Lawrence's condition continued to spiral. Fever took hold, bringing with it waves of delirium. His eyes, usually sharp and guarded, now darted around the room, seeing things that weren't there. "Evelyn?" he called out suddenly, his hand reaching toward Alma. "Evelyn, is that you?" Alma froze, her heart skipping a beat. In his confused state, Lawrence was seeing his dead wife's face in hers. She should correct him, maintain professional boundaries. Instead, something deep inside her softened at the sight of his tears. "The sea was too rough," he wept, clutching her hand. I couldn't save any of you." Rather than break the spell of his confusion, Alma reached for the bookshelf near his bed. Among the leather-bound volumes, she found a weathered sea journal. Opening it carefully, she began to read aloud, her voice soft and steady. April 15th, 1998. The Mediterranean stretched before us like polished glass this morning. Dolphins played in our wake as we sailed past Corsica. The words seemed to calm him, and his grip on her hand gradually relaxed. She read for hours, describing peaceful voyages and starlit nights, until Lawrence finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Only then did she allow herself to really look at him. This man who might be her father, who might have made an unthinkable choice on a storm-tossed night 21 years ago. When she was certain Lawrence was deeply asleep, Alma slipped out into the hallway. The estate was quiet, except for the distant ticking of antique clocks. Her footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood floors as she walked deeper into the manor's shadows. At the end of a long corridor, she found what had caught her attention earlier, a heavy wooden door with brass fittings. The handle refused to turn under her touch. Locked, just as she expected. But earlier that day, while straightening a portrait in the library, she had noticed something. An old key hanging on a hook behind the frame. Before she could turn back toward the library, a throat cleared behind her. Mr. Kellen stood there, his usually impassive face tight with disapproval. "That room is private," he said, his voice clipped. "You're here to care, not to dig." Alma stepped back from the door, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry. I was just exploring while Mr. Gable sleeps." "Some doors are better left closed, Miss Alma." His eyes held a warning, but also something else. Was it sympathy? "Focus on your duties. Nothing good comes from stirring up the past." She nodded and retreated to Lawrence's room, but her mind kept returning to that locked door. After her shift ended and the night staff arrived, she waited until the house grew still again. The portrait in the library seemed to watch her as she carefully lifted it and retrieved the key from its hiding place. The locked door opened with a soft click. Alma's heart pounded as she slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating what appeared to be a private study. Books and papers covered every surface, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets. She found the ship logs first, dozens of them, meticulously documenting years of voyages. Then came the photographs. Evelyn Gable in various locations, her smile bright and alive. In later pictures, she was pregnant, her hands resting protectively over her growing belly. The resemblance between them was undeniable now. The same dark eyes, the same high cheekbones, even the same way of tilting their heads slightly in photographs. Near the window sat a large chest made of polished wood. 2 locks secured its lid, and on the front, elegant letters were engraved. E.G. Evelyn's initials. Alma ran her fingers over the engraving, wondering what secrets the chest might hold. Her eyes swept the room again, taking in every detail. Above the desk hung a simple frame containing a charcoal drawing. Alma moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. The drawing showed 2 baby girls, sleeping peacefully side by side. In the corner, barely visible, was a date. 2003. With trembling fingers, she lifted the frame from its hook. There, Tucked into the backing was another key, smaller than the first, but ornately carved. It matched the locks on Evelyn's chest perfectly. Alma's hands shook as she knelt before the chest. The key turned smoothly in both locks, and the lid opened with a soft creak. Inside, preserved beneath layers of tissue paper, she found baby clothes, tiny knitted booties, and a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. On top of everything lay a single envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting on it made her heart stop. "To my daughters, if they ever lived." Alma sank into the desk chair, the letter heavy in her hands. Tears blurred her vision before she could even break the seal. All her life, she had wondered about her origins, about the parents who had given her up. Now, sitting in this room filled with fragments of the past, the truth was literally in her grasp. She stared at the envelope, her mother's handwriting swimming before her eyes. Each carefully formed letter seemed to hold the weight of decades of secrets, of choices made in desperate moments, of love and loss and possibility. Her tears fell onto the aged paper as she held it, marking the envelope with spots of darkness like rain on the sea. In the stillness of Lawrence Gable's private study, Alma sat motionless, the envelope heavy in her trembling hands. The only sound was the measured tick-tock of an antique nautical clock mounted on the wall, its brass pendulum swinging back and forth like a metronome counting the seconds of her hesitation. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room's wooden floors and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. She traced the careful cursive of the address with her finger. "To my daughters, if they ever lived." The paper felt delicate, like it might crumble under the weight of its own secrets. Alma reached into her pocket and withdrew a small flashlight. She didn't dare turn on the study's lights and risk drawing attention. The seal broke with a soft crack that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Inside, several pages of thick stationery were covered in a strong, determined hand, different from the writing on the envelope. This wasn't her mother's letter after all. It was Lawrence's. The beam of her flashlight illuminated the first words, "I write this knowing I may never have the courage to seek the truth, nor the right to ask forgiveness if it exists to be given. The sea holds secrets I have carried alone for too long." Alma's hands shook harder as she continued reading. Lawrence described that terrible night in detail, the growing storm, the increasingly rough seas, the way Evelyn had tried to smile through her pain even as things went wrong. His words painted the scene with devastating clarity. The thunder that drowned out screams, the desperate attempts of an overwhelmed medic, the moment Evelyn slipped away leaving nothing but silence, and two apparently lifeless infants. The medic's hands were shaking, Lawrence had written. He listened for heartbeats, checked for breath, and declared what I was already too broken to question, that I had lost not just my beloved wife, but our daughters as well. In that moment, the world ceased to make sense. The storm raged outside while inside, I held Evelyn's cold hand and stared at two tiny bodies that never drew breath. Tears blurred Alma's vision as she read about the hours that followed. The ship's radio was damaged. Help was hours away. The medic, pale and stammering, suggested they would need to preserve the bodies until they reached port. "I couldn't bear it," Lawrence wrote. "The thought of my children lying in cold storage, of subjecting their perfect, still forms to clinical examination and bureaucratic process. In my grief-addled mind, I convinced myself that the sea was kinder. It had been Evelyn's greatest love after all. What better place for our family to rest?" The next paragraph was harder to read, the handwriting becoming unsteady. I wrapped them both in the softest blankets we had, white like clouds on a summer day. I waited for a break in the storm. I whispered a prayer. "Forgive what you do not know. May the sea carry you where I cannot." Then I let them go. Alma had to pause, pressing her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The clock continued its steady rhythm, grounding her in the present moment as she read about the past that had shaped her entire life. But then, Lawrence's writing continued. I heard it, or thought I did. A cry, so faint it could have been the wind or my imagination, or my heart's desperate wish for a different truth. I told myself it had to be the storm. I convinced myself because the alternative, that I had condemned my living children to the waves, was too horrific to contemplate. I chose to believe the medic. I chose to believe they were gone before I let them go. The alternative would have destroyed what remained of my sanity. The letter went on, describing years of sleepless nights, of searching the faces of young women on the street, of hiring private investigators only to lose courage and cancel their services before they could report their findings. Lawrence wrote of building his empire larger and larger, as if success could fill the void left by his losses. But lately, the letter concluded, I have seen your eyes before, hers. They haunt me in my dreams. They look back at me from photographs of Evelyn. If you lived, if by some miracle you survived what I did in my darkest hour, I am more sorry than any words could express. If not, may the sea carry this truth to your souls, and may you rest in the peace I have never found. Your father, Lawrence. Alma's tears fell freely now, spotting the carpet beneath her chair. The weight of Lawrence's confession pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. All these years she and Ruth had imagined abandonment, calculated cruelty, or cold indifference. But the truth was both simpler and more complicated. A grieving man, a medical mistake, and a choice made in the fog of unbearable loss. With careful movements, she returned the letter to its envelope and placed it back in the chest. But before closing the lid, she noticed something else. A silver locket identical to the one she wore, and beside it a photograph she had never seen before. It showed Evelyn, radiant in early pregnancy, standing at the bow of a ship with her face turned toward the sun. Alma took both items, knowing she would need them for Ruth to understand. The chest closed with a soft click. Alma restored everything else to its exact place, erasing the evidence of her presence. Only then did she slip out of the study, locking the door behind her and returning the key to its hiding place behind the portrait. Back in her small room at the estate, Alma's hands trembled as she dialed Ruth's number. It was late, but she knew her sister would answer. They had never ignored each other's calls, not once in all their years apart. Ruth, she said softly when the line connected. He didn't know. He thought we were dead. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long and heavy. Alma could picture her sister's face, the way her jaw would be clenched, the struggle between anger and understanding playing across her features. Finally, Ruth ended the call without a word, leaving Alma alone with the weight of a truth that changed everything and nothing all at once. Ruth stalked across her small Naples apartment, her phone clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Alma's words echoed in her head like a broken record. He didn't know. He thought we were dead. The explanation felt too neat, too convenient for a man on his deathbed seeking absolution. Damn it, she shouted, grabbing the nearest object, a thick immigration law textbook, and hurling it across the room. It hit the wall with a satisfying thud, pages fluttering before it landed spine up on the floor. Her roommate Clara appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas despite the late hour. Ruth? What's going on? My father's dying. Ruth spat out the words like they tasted bitter. And he thinks that makes him innocent. She kicked the corner of her desk, immediately regretting it as pain shot through her toe. Clara crossed the room carefully as if approaching a wounded animal. Your father? I thought you didn't know who he was. Oh, we know now. Ruth laughed, but there was no humor in it. He's Lawrence Gable, the shipping magnate, the one in all those business magazines, the one my sister is taking care of while he dies. She collapsed onto her bed, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw spots. Clara sat beside her, quiet for a moment. Is that good news or bad news? He threw us into the ocean when we were born, Ruth said flatly. But apparently, he thought we were already dead, so that makes it okay. She stood up again, unable to stay still, and began pulling out folders from her desk drawer. The contents spilled across her bed. The old sea chart she'd found as a child, newspaper clippings about Lawrence Gable's business empire, photocopies of shipping records from 2003. She'd been collecting pieces of this puzzle for years without knowing what picture they formed. I need to go to the monastery, Ruth announced suddenly, stuffing the papers into her messenger bag. Mother Silvana must have known something. She had to. It's almost midnight, Clara pointed out gently. They're nuns. They're always awake for prayers or something. Ruth was already pulling on her jacket. I'll be back. Whenever. The drive to the monastery took just over an hour, but Ruth barely noticed the time passing. Her mind raced with questions, with accusations, with the image of a grieving man dropping 2 bundles into the sea. The moon hung low and full over the water as she parked her car. She rang the bell 3 times, just as Yusef had done 21 years ago when he left 2 baby girls on these steps. Sister Benedetta answered, older now, but still quick to recognize Ruth. I need to see Mother Silvana, Ruth said before the nun could speak. It's important. Mother Silvana was in her office, a small room that smelled of old books and candle wax. She didn't seem surprised to see Ruth at this hour. Did you know? Ruth demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Did you ever try to find our parents? The old nun's face remained carefully neutral, but her hands, folded on her desk, tightened slightly. Ruth, some things are better. Don't, Ruth cut her off. Don't tell me what's better, just tell me the truth. Silvana was quiet for a long moment, studying Ruth's face. Finally, she opened a drawer and withdrew a small key. Yes, she said softly. I did try to find them. Once. Ruth's heart pounded as Silvana unlocked a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder. What did you find? I received a response, Silvana admitted, but I burned it without reading it. You what? Ruth's voice cracked. How could you? I didn't think anyone who discarded newborns at sea deserved to reclaim them, Silvana said firmly, but there was pain in her eyes. I made that choice. Perhaps it was wrong, but I made it to protect you both. Ruth sank into a chair, her anger warring with a new, uncomfortable understanding. She had spent years imagining her parents as monsters, but now she was faced with the complexity of human choice, Silvana's protective instinct, Lawrence's grief-stricken mistake, even her own reflexive rage. You should have told us, she whispered, but the words held less venom than before. Yes, Silvana agreed simply. I should have. When Ruth returned to her apartment, the sun was beginning to rise. Clara was still awake, sitting at their small kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. Want to talk about it? She asked, pushing 1 cup toward Ruth. Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat ground her. Mother Silvana knew how to contact him. Years ago. She chose not to tell us. Are you angry? Yes. Number I don't know. Ruth took a long sip of coffee. Everyone keeps making choices about our lives without asking us. Silvana hiding the truth. Lawrence dropping us in the ocean. Even Alma going to work for him without telling me first. Clara was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. You know, she said finally, closure isn't the same thing as forgiveness. You don't have to forgive anyone. But maybe you need to see him, just to know for yourself, to make your own choice for once. Ruth stared into her coffee cup, watching the light play across its surface. She thought about Alma, alone in that house with their dying father. She thought about the letter that Silvana had burned, about all the questions that had haunted her since childhood. Without a word, she pulled out her laptop and opened the train schedule. There was a direct route to Alma's town leaving in 3 hours. Ruth booked a one-way ticket, not letting herself think too hard about what she would do when she arrived. She packed a small bag quickly, mechanically, as if someone else was controlling her movements. Only when she was ready to leave did she realize she hadn't told Alma she was coming. Good, she thought. Let someone else deal with uncertainty for a change. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Gable estate, creating patterns across the marble floors. Alma was checking Lawrence's medication schedule when the unexpected buzz of the front gate broke the silence. She frowned, not expecting any deliveries or visitors this early. Through the security monitor, she saw a familiar figure standing at the gate, Ruth, her face set in determination. Alma's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected her sister to come, especially not without warning. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the intercom button. "Ruth? Let me in," came the clipped response. Alma buzzed her through and hurried to the front door, watching as Ruth marched up the long driveway. Her sister's shoulders were rigid, her messenger bag clutched tightly against her side. When she reached the door, Ruth didn't wait for a greeting. "Take me to him," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Alma nodded, understanding the fragility of this moment. He's just had his morning medication. He might be drowsy. "I don't care." They walked through the quiet halls, their footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. Alma noticed Ruth taking in the expensive artwork, the antique furniture, all the trappings of wealth that could have been part of their childhood. Her sister's jaw clenched tighter with each step. Outside Lawrence's room, Alma paused. "Ruth, he's very weak. Try to just open the door." Ruth cut her off, but her voice wavered slightly. The room was dim, with only a sliver of sunlight sneaking through the heavy curtains. Medical equipment hummed softly, creating a steady rhythm with Lawrence's shallow breathing. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. The hospital bed, the IV stands, the frail figure beneath the blankets. Alma guided her sister to the foot of the bed. Ruth gripped the metal frame, her knuckles white as she watched their father struggle for each breath. His face was gaunt, skin yellowed from liver failure, nothing like the powerful man from the magazine covers. Minutes passed in tense silence. Alma busied herself checking the IV lines, adjusting the oxygen flow, anything to give Ruth space to process this moment. She watched her sister's face from the corner of her eye, seeing the conflict of emotions play across it, anger warring with something softer, more uncertain. Lawrence stirred, his eyelids fluttering. When they opened, his gaze fell directly on Ruth. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice rough. Ruth didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, watching as Alma adjusted the IV drip rate. Lawrence's eyes never left Ruth's face, though they seemed to see someone else there. "The twins," he mumbled, his words slurring slightly from the medication. "The storm, it was so dark. Couldn't see. Had to say the prayer." Alma glanced at Ruth, seeing her sister's stern expression beginning to crack. The rehearsed anger, the practiced speeches Ruth must have prepared, they all seemed to falter in the face of this broken man's delirium. "The prayer," Lawrence continued, his hand reaching weakly toward Ruth. "Forgive what you do not know. May the sea carry you." His voice cracked on the last words. Ruth's breathing became uneven. Her hands released their death grip on the bed frame, falling limply to her sides. Alma saw tears gathering in her sister's eyes, though Ruth blinked them back furiously. Lawrence's rambling continued, fragments of that terrible night spilling out in his semi-conscious state. The medic said, "No heartbeats. Evelyn was gone. So much blood. Couldn't save them. Couldn't save anyone." Each word seemed to chip away at Ruth's carefully constructed wall of anger. Her shoulders began to shake slightly, though she remained silent. Alma wanted to reach out, to comfort her sister, but she knew Ruth needed to face this moment on her own. The confession continued, Lawrence's words becoming more distressed. Heard a cry. Thought it was the wind. Had to be the wind. They were gone. All gone. Ruth took a step backward, her face a storm of emotions. Lawrence's eyes suddenly cleared, focusing on her with unexpected lucidity. His hand shot out with surprising strength, catching Ruth's wrist. "Ruth," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "Forgive me." The touch seemed to break something in Ruth. She yanked her hand away as if burned, turning on her heel and fleeing the room. Alma caught up with her in the hallway just as Ruth's composure finally shattered. Her sister collapsed against her, years of anger and pain dissolving into gut-wrenching sobs. Alma held her tightly, feeling Ruth's entire body shake with the force of her grief. They sank to the floor together, Ruth clutching Alma's sweater like she used to when they were children and the world felt too big, too scary. "I had it all planned," Ruth choked out between sobs. "Everything I was going to say to him. I was going to make him feel as small as we did, as lost, as afraid. She drew in a shuddering breath. But he's already there, isn't he? He's been there this whole time. Alma stroked her sister's hair, her own tears falling silently. From Lawrence's room came the steady beep of monitors, measuring out the moments of their shared pain in electronic pulses. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the Gable estate, casting a soft glow on the polished granite countertops. Ruth sat at the large island, her fingers absently tracing the rim of an empty cup. She hadn't spoken since her breakdown in the hallway the night before, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Alma moved quietly around the kitchen, her movements practiced and gentle. The familiar ritual of making tea provided a sense of normalcy in this surreal moment. She filled the kettle, the sound of running water, the only noise breaking the heavy silence. As she waited for it to boil, she watched her sister's reflection in the window. Ruth's usually sharp features were softened by exhaustion, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. The kettle clicked off and Alma prepared 2 cups with the same care she showed her patients. Ruth's cup she made exactly as her sister had taken it since childhood, strong English breakfast tea, steeped for precisely 4 minutes. No sugar. Her own cup she prepared with a splash of milk, the way the nuns had taught them. She placed Ruth's cup in front of her, the ceramic making a soft click against the countertop. Ruth's fingers automatically wrapped around the warm surface, but she didn't drink. Alma settled onto the stool beside her sister, close enough that their shoulders almost touched but not quite. Minutes stretched by, marked only by the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional distant sound of the medical equipment from upstairs. Alma sipped her tea, waiting. She knew her sister well enough to recognize when she needed space to find her words. Finally, Ruth's voice broke the silence, rough from crying and disuse. I hated him for 22 years. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her cup. Now I don't know who I hate. Alma set her cup down carefully, considering her response. After years of working with terminal patients and their families, she had learned that sometimes the simplest truths were the most powerful. In hospice, she began softly, I've watched so many people slip away. Their families come in carrying decades of hurt, of anger. They sit there, holding on to their pain like it's the only thing keeping them upright. Ruth turned to look at her sister, really look at her for the first time that morning. Alma continued, her voice gentle but firm. What I've learned is that forgiveness isn't a gift we give to others. It's a release we give ourselves. Sometimes holding on to anger is harder than letting it go. The words seemed to settle in the space between them. Ruth's tea had grown cold, untouched. She pushed it away slightly, her hand moving to touch the locket that hung around her neck, a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious. Remember when we used to sit on the monastery steps? Ruth asked suddenly, her voice taking on a distant quality. Every sunset, watching the waves. We'd make up stories about our mother. Imagine she was out there somewhere, searching for us. Alma nodded, her own hand rising to touch her matching locket. The memory was vivid, the rough stone steps beneath them, the salt air in their faces, the way the setting sun turned the Mediterranean into liquid gold. They would sit there for hours sometimes, 2 little girls holding hands, weaving elaborate tales about their lost family. Ruth's fingers traced the weathered Latin inscription on her locket, Ignoce quod nescis. Forgive what you do not know. The words seemed to carry new weight now, heavy with understanding they hadn't possessed as children. You ever think he heard us crying? Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That night when he... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Alma was quiet for a moment, remembering Lawrence's delirious confessions from the night before. I think he did, she replied softly, but he was too broken to believe it. She paused, then added, sometimes the truth is harder to accept than a lie we've built our life around. Ruth absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. The morning had advanced, and somewhere above them, They could hear the muffled sounds of the day nurse arriving for her shift change. Without speaking, both sisters rose from their stools. They moved through the house together, their steps naturally falling into sync as they climbed the stairs. Outside Lawrence's room, Ruth paused, taking a deep breath. Alma waited patiently, understanding the magnitude of what they were about to do. When they entered, Lawrence was awake but barely so, his skin pale against the white pillows. The morning light through the partially drawn curtains cast strange shadows across his face, emphasizing the hollows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes tracked their movement as they entered, recognition and something like hope flickering across his features. Alma took her usual place by his bedside, checking his vital signs with practiced efficiency while maintaining her gentle presence. Ruth stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, her internal struggle visible in the tension of her shoulders. Then slowly, deliberately, she moved to the other side of the bed. The chair there creaked slightly as she lowered herself into it. Her hand came to rest on the bed beside Lawrence's, not touching, but close enough that the distance between them felt like a physical thing, fragile and significant. Lawrence's eyes filled with tears that spilled silently down his hollow cheeks. He made no move to close the distance between their hands, seeming to understand that this small gesture from Ruth was more than he had any right to expect. The three of them sat there in the morning light, father and daughters, separated by decades of silence and grief, yet sharing the same space for the first time since that terrible night at sea. The only sounds were the steady beep of the heart monitor and Lawrence's labored breathing, marking time in this moment of unspoken reconciliation. The gap between Ruth's hand and Lawrence's remained, a small space that contained 22 years of loss, anger, and confusion. But it was no longer an uncrossable chasm. It had become something else, a measure of how far they had come, and how far they might still have to go. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet estate. Rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to the otherwise silent house. The medical equipment upstairs had been temporarily silenced for Lawrence's comfort, leaving only the sound of water against glass and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Alma walked the darkened corridors, checking rooms out of habit. She paused when she noticed a faint glow coming from beneath the study door. Through the gap, she could see Ruth's silhouette, sitting alone in one of the leather armchairs. A single candle burned on the desk beside the old letter chest, casting dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Pushing the door open slowly, Alma entered the room. Ruth didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the chest that held so many of their family's secrets. The candlelight caught the silver of her locket, making it gleam against her dark sweater. "Can't sleep?" Alma asked softly, moving to stand beside her sister's chair. Ruth shook her head, still staring at the chest. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, the way he looked at me today." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Alma reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the folded letter she discovered earlier. The paper was thick, expensive, yellowed slightly with age. The words, "To my daughters, if they ever lived," were written in Lawrence's precise handwriting across the front. "I found this when I first discovered the chest," Alma said, holding it out to Ruth. "Maybe you should read it." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she took the letter. She unfolded it carefully, as if it might crumble to dust in her fingers. The candle provided just enough light to read by, throwing warm light across the pages. Alma settled into the chair opposite her sister, watching as Ruth's eyes moved across the lines. She could almost track Ruth's progress through the letter by the changing expressions on her face, the tightening of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows, the way her fingers gripped the paper more tightly at certain passages. When Ruth reached the part about Lawrence hearing a cry after placing them in the water, her breath caught audibly in her throat. Her eyes stopped moving across the page, fixed on that single, devastating admission. "He heard us," Ruth whispered, her voice rough. "He actually heard us crying and still—" "But he convinced himself it was the wind," Alma added gently. "The human mind can rationalize almost anything when the truth is too painful to bear." Ruth lowered the letter to her lap, staring into the candlelight. "You know what's strange?" she said after a long moment. Just yesterday, I was ready to destroy him. You remember what I said at the monastery? That if we ever found who left us, I'd drag them to court? Alma nodded, remembering her sister's fierce declaration all those years ago. Well, now I have it. Ruth lifted the letter slightly. His confession, right here in his own handwriting. Evidence of abandonment, endangerment, everything a prosecutor would need. She gave a hollow laugh. But I don't want justice anymore. I just wanted him to know he lost something real, that we were real. The candlelight flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the rain continued its steady pattern against the windows. The sisters sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. "Can I tell you something?" Ruth finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "All these years, fighting deportation cases, arguing for families to stay together, I told myself I was doing it for them, for the children who didn't deserve to lose their parents, their identities." She paused, twisting her locket between her fingers. "But I was really fighting for us, for the little girls we were, trying to prove that no one has the right to throw away someone else's future." Alma reached across the space between them, taking her sister's hand. "You've helped so many people, Ruth. Whatever your reasons, that matters." "But it didn't fix us, did it?" Ruth's voice cracked slightly. "All the cases I won, all the families I reunited, it didn't answer the question of who we really are." They talked through the night, their voices low and intimate in the candlelit room. Ruth spoke about her first case, defending a mother separated from her children at the border. Alma shared stories of her patients, how many of them found peace with their past before the end. They remembered their childhood at the monastery, the good parts, not just the pain of being lost. Sister Benedetta teaching them to make bread, Mother Silvana reading them stories the way the other nuns would sneak them extra desserts on feast days. As the candle burned lower, casting their shadows longer on the walls, Ruth shifted in her chair. The letter lay forgotten in her lap, its words already absorbed into their shared understanding of their complicated history. "He's still our father," Ruth said finally, the words coming slowly as if she was discovering their truth as she spoke them. "That doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing ever could. But I think—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think I need to know who I am beyond what he did, beyond being the baby he put in the sea." Alma squeezed her sister's hand, understanding completely. The weight of their past felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more evenly distributed between them. The rain had stopped sometime during their conversation, leaving only the occasional drip from the eaves. The candle sputtered in its holder, nearly spent. Neither sister moved to replace it. Instead, they remained in their chairs, hands clasped across the space between them, until exhaustion finally overcame them. They fell asleep like that, heads tilted against the leather backs of their chairs, their breathing falling into the same rhythm as it had when they were infants in a monastery cradle. The letter rested in Ruth's lap, its confession heard and acknowledged at last. Through the study windows, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, promising a new day and, perhaps, a new way forward. The next few days brought a rapid decline in Lawrence's condition. Alma noticed the changes first, his breathing becoming more labored, his periods of lucidity growing shorter. She kept detailed notes in a small leather-bound journal, documenting every shift in his symptoms with the careful precision she'd learned in her nursing training. "Blood pressure dropping again," she wrote one morning, the pen moving steadily across the page. "Increased confusion during evening hours. Pain levels rising despite medication adjustments." Ruth, who had initially planned to stay only 2 days, found herself extending her visit indefinitely. She called her law office in Naples, arranging for her cases to be temporarily reassigned. During the day, she occupied herself by organizing Lawrence's study, sorting through decades of shipping manifests and business correspondence. Mr. Kellen, who had initially regarded Ruth with cautious suspicion, gradually warmed to her presence. They began sharing quiet breakfasts in the kitchen, the house manager preparing toast and coffee while Ruth reviewed old family documents. "He kept everything, you know," Kellen mentioned one morning, sliding a fresh cup of coffee across the table to Ruth. Every contract, every letter, every photograph. Said it was important to remember where you came from. Ruth nodded, spreading jam on her toast. Even the things that hurt? Especially those, Kellen replied softly. One morning, as Alma was checking on another patient in town, Ruth brought Lawrence his breakfast tray. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a gentle light across his bed. His eyes, clouded with medication and confusion, fixed on her face. "You sing like your mother," he mumbled, clearly mistaking her for Alma. She loved the old songs. Ruth froze, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. She wanted to correct him, to maintain the emotional distance she'd carefully constructed, but something in his vulnerable expression made her hold her tongue. Later that afternoon, while organizing a cabinet full of medical records, Ruth discovered a leather-bound journal tucked behind a stack of old x-rays. The handwriting inside was different from Lawrence's, more flowing, more intimate. It was Evelyn's. The journal was filled with sea poems, sketches of waves and shorelines, and most importantly, letters addressed to the twins. Ruth's hands shook as she carried the journal to Alma's room that evening. The sisters sat together on Alma's bed, the journal open between them. Ruth's voice was unusually soft as she read aloud. "My dearest ones, the doctor says there are two of you dancing beneath my heart. I feel your movements like waves, gentle then strong. Your father bought a tiny silver compass today, one for each of you. He says you'll never be lost at sea like he once was. I dream of teaching you the old songs, the ones my grandmother sang about the stars guiding sailors home." Alma wiped tears from her cheeks, but Ruth was surprised to find herself crying too. Really crying for the first time in years. The tears came silently at first, then in deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to release decades of carefully contained grief. During Lawrence's worst moments of pain, Alma would sit beside his bed and hum the old lullaby she and Ruth had learned at the monastery. The simple melody seemed to soothe him, easing the lines of tension from his face. Once, faintly but distinctly, he hummed a few notes back to her, though his eyes remained closed. The evening brought a brief respite in Lawrence's symptoms. The twins helped Kellen move him to the balcony, where the sea air seemed to revive him slightly. They arranged themselves around him, Alma perched on a small stool beside his wheelchair, Ruth seated in a chair across from them both. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. A gentle breeze carried the salt smell of the sea up to their sheltered spot. Lawrence's breathing had eased somewhat, and his eyes were clearer than they had been in days. He looked at them both, really looked at them, with a clarity that had been rare lately. A faint smile touched his lips, softening the harsh lines pain had carved into his face. "I see her in both of you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She would have been proud. The twins exchanged a look across the space between them. In that moment of shared understanding, they both felt the weight of those words, the acknowledgement of their mother, the recognition of their connection to her, and perhaps most importantly, the admission that they were always meant to be more than lost children of the sea. The first hints of dawn painted the horizon in pale strokes when Alma noticed the change in Lawrence's breathing. She had been dozing in the armchair beside his bed, her nurse's instincts still alert even in half-sleep. The rhythm of his breaths had shifted, becoming more shallow, more irregular, with longer pauses between each intake of air. She knew what it meant. After years of working in palliative care, she had learned to recognize death's quiet approach. Rising quietly from her chair, she moved through the dimly lit room to where Ruth slept, curled up on the window seat, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. "Ruth," Alma whispered, touching her sister's arm gently. "Wake up. It's time." Ruth's eyes opened immediately, as if she hadn't really been sleeping at all. She took one look at Alma's face and understood. Without a word, she stood and followed her sister to Lawrence's bedside. The medical equipment cast a soft blue glow across the room. The monitors displayed Lawrence's weakening vital signs in steady digital readouts. Alma moved with practiced efficiency, checking the morphine drip while Ruth adjusted the pillows supporting their father's head. "Is he in pain?" Ruth asked softly, watching Lawrence's face for any signs of discomfort. Alma shook her head. The morphine's keeping him comfortable, he's just letting go. They positioned themselves on either side of the bed. Ruth took Lawrence's right hand, noting how cold his fingers felt against her palm. Alma held his left, her thumb moving in small, soothing circles across his skin. The gesture was so natural, so instinctive, something she had done countless times for other patients. But this was different. This was their father. The room grew lighter as the sun continued its slow rise. Soft, golden light filtered through the gauzy curtains, warming the austere space. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked time as father and daughters waited together in the growing dawn. Lawrence's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused at first. Then his gaze settled on Ruth's face. Unlike the confused recognition of previous days, this time his eyes were clear. His lips moved, forming her name with unexpected clarity. Ruth. The sound of her name, her real name spoken with such certainty, made Ruth's breath catch in her throat. She tightened her grip on his hand, unable to speak. Alma leaned forward, her dark hair falling forward as she brought her face close to Lawrence's. "We're the girls," she whispered, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't lose us." With trembling fingers, she reached for the locket that had hung around her neck since childhood. The clasp opened easily, and she placed the small silver pendant in Lawrence's palm. The Latin inscription caught the morning light. Ignosce quod nescis. Ruth watched her sister's actions, then slowly reached for her own locket. The metal was warm from resting against her skin. She had worn it every day for 22 years, a constant reminder of both loss and survival. Now she placed it beside its twin in their father's hand, completing the circle of their shared history. Tears rolled down Lawrence's cheeks, tracking silent paths across his pale skin. His fingers curled weakly around the lockets, as if trying to hold on to this tangible proof of his daughter's existence. His lips moved again, forming what would be his final word. "Thank you." The monitors registered the change first, the slowing heartbeat, the dropping oxygen levels. But Alma and Ruth felt it in the gradual loosening of his grip, in the way his breathing softened until it simply ceased. The machines went still, their steady beeping replaced by a single continuous tone that Alma quickly silenced. Lawrence Gable died as the sun fully cleared the horizon, his hands joined with those of his daughters. The twin lockets nestled in his palm like small silver shells washed up from the sea. The door opened quietly and Mr. Kellen entered the room. The house manager's face was drawn with grief, but he moved with the same dignified composure he had always shown. He didn't speak. There were no words adequate for this moment. Ruth stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She reached across the bed and, with infinite gentleness, closed Lawrence's eyes. The gesture was both farewell and forgiveness, though she wasn't sure she could yet name it as such. Alma retrieved the letter from the bedside table, Lawrence's confession and apology, written years ago to daughters he believed lost to the sea. She folded it carefully along its well-worn creases and placed it atop his chest, a final testament to both his guilt and his love. The room fell into complete stillness. Grief hung in the air like morning mist, but beneath it lay something else, a strange peace, as if some long-held breath had finally been released. The four people in the room remained motionless, bearing witness to this moment when past and present, loss and redemption, merged in the quiet light of dawn. The morning of Lawrence Gable's funeral dawned clear and crisp, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt from the Mediterranean. The estate grounds had been meticulously prepared, though the ceremony would be notably modest. A small gathering area had been arranged near the cliff's edge, where chairs faced a simple wooden casket adorned only with white roses. Alma stood before her mirror, adjusting the collar of her black dress. It was plain and understated, purchased hastily from a local shop. She hadn't packed for a funeral when she'd first arrived at the estate as a nurse. Behind her, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, already dressed in a similar dark ensemble, absently turning her recovered locket between her fingers. "The press is still camped outside the gates," Ruth said, her voice tight with irritation. Mr. Kellen had to threaten them with legal action to keep them back. Alma nodded, pinning back a strand of dark hair. They'll want statements about the long-lost daughter's story, but they can wait forever. The sisters had declined every interview request, every eager journalist hoping to break the story of Lawrence Gable's miraculous reunion with his presumed dead children. Their privacy mattered more than public curiosity. Outside, the small group of attendees began to gather. Mr. Kellen stood greeting the few trusted staff members who had earned an invitation: the longtime cook, Mrs. Rossi, the groundskeeper, Antonio, and a handful of others who had served the Gable household faithfully for years. They spoke in hushed tones, their respect evident in every careful movement. The ceremony itself was brief and dignified. No priest presided. Lawrence had left specific instructions about that. Instead, Mr. Kellen read a short passage from one of Lawrence's favorite books about the sea. The words floated out over the cliff edge, carried away by the wind. The ocean knows no boundaries, no limitations. It takes what it will and returns what it chooses. Alma and Ruth sat in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together. They didn't cry. They had done enough of that in the past few days. Instead, they watched with steady eyes as the casket was lowered into the ground, in a plot beside where Evelyn had been laid to rest 22 years ago. As the small gathering began to disperse, a sleek black car pulled up to the estate. Marina Belcourt, Lawrence's attorney, emerged carrying a leather portfolio. Her heels clicked against the stone path as she approached the sisters. "I'm sorry to intrude on this day," she said, her voice professional but gentle. But Mr. Gable was very specific about the timing of this meeting. They gathered in Lawrence's study, the room that had first revealed their true identity to Alma. Mr. Kellen brought tea that no one touched. Marina settled behind the massive oak desk, spreading out several documents with practiced efficiency. "I'll be direct," Marina began, adjusting her reading glasses. "This is the final will and testament of Lawrence Edmund Gable." Ruth sat forward slightly, her lawyer's instincts engaging despite the personal nature of the moment. Alma remained still, her hands folded in her lap. As Marina read through the legal language, both sisters listened intently. The revelation, when it came, was unexpected. Lawrence had left nothing directly to either of them. Instead, the bulk of his considerable estate, the shipping company, the properties, the investments, had been transferred to the coastal monastery in Sicily where they had been raised. "What?" Ruth's voice cut through the formal atmosphere. "Why not to us?" Marina removed her glasses and picked up a separate envelope. Mr. Gable included this note with his instructions. She began to read. "I cannot reclaim what I discarded, but I can honor who raised them better than I ever could." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alma closed her eyes briefly, understanding the depth of their father's final choice. "There's one more thing," Marina said, reaching into her portfolio. She withdrew a weathered page, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. "This was found among your mother's personal effects. Mr. Gable wanted you to have it." The page was from Evelyn's journal, a delicate sketch of 2 infant girls rendered with loving detail. Beneath the drawing, in elegant script, were the words, "My soul is in the sea. My daughters, if they live, will carry the tide inside them." After Marina left, the sisters made their way down to the cliffs behind the estate. The path was narrow but well-worn, winding through wild coastal grasses until it reached a natural viewpoint over the Mediterranean. They stood there, the wind pulling at their black dresses, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. "I've been thinking," Alma said finally, her voice barely audible above the sound of the sea, "about leaving the hospital." Ruth turned to look at her sister, questioning. "I want to open a seaside hospice," Alma continued. "Somewhere people can find peace in their final days with the ocean nearby. Somewhere that feels like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Like coming home." Ruth nodded slowly, understanding. "I've already started something too." She pulled a folded document from her pocket. "Filed the paperwork yesterday. It's called the Salt and Grace Initiative, a legal defense fund for displaced children." They stood in silence for a long moment, letting the significance of their choices settle between them. The wind carried the salt spray up from the waves, misting their faces with tiny droplets that could have been tears, could have been baptism. Neither sister spoke again as they turned back toward the house. They walked slowly, their shoulders occasionally brushing, no longer defined by their status as orphans. They were simply women who had survived, who had found their way back from the sea, who carried the tide within them just as their mother had predicted. The path curved gently upward, leading them home. 1 year after Lawrence Gable's funeral, the Mediterranean stretched out like polished glass beneath a cloudless sky. The small sailboat barely disturbed the surface as it drifted just beyond sight of the monastery's weathered walls. Salt-laden breeze caught the loose strands of Alma's dark hair as she steadied herself against the gentle roll of the deck. Ruth stood opposite her sister, one hand resting on the boat's worn wooden railing. Between them sat a simple ceramic urn, its glazed surface catching the afternoon light. They had chosen it together. Nothing ornate, nothing that spoke of wealth or status. Just a vessel to carry their father home. The boat's captain, an elderly local fisherman who had known the sisters since childhood, kept a respectful distance at the helm. He had taught them to swim in these very waters, never knowing they had once been claimed by these same waves as infants. Alma adjusted the collar of her light linen dress, touching the locket that once again hung around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought them here. Ruth wore hers as well, though she had been reluctant to put it back on after their father's death. Some things, she had said, while slipping the chain over her head that morning, are meant to come full circle. The water lapped gently against the hull, creating a rhythm that seemed to match their heartbeats. They had chosen this spot carefully, far enough from shore to feel the true depth of the sea, but close enough to see the monastery's bell tower rising against the azure sky. This was where their story had begun, where the ocean had first given them back to the world. Ruth lifted the urn with trembling hands, her lawyer's confidence momentarily replaced by the weight of the moment. "His last request," she said softly, recalling Lawrence's written words, "Let my last breath return to the waters that bore you." Alma reached into her pocket and withdrew a worn leather journal, their mother's diary, discovered among Lawrence's belongings. The pages had softened with age and handling, marked with countless readings over the past year. She opened it to a ribbon-marked page, the paper crinkling softly in the sea air. "The ocean gives, the ocean takes," Alma read, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "But it remembers, and it forgives." The words, written in Evelyn's elegant hand decades ago, seemed to hover in the air between them. Ruth's fingers tightened on the urn. With deliberate care, she removed the lid. The ashes caught the sunlight, gray and fine as sea mist. She paused, looking at Alma, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Ruth began to scatter the ashes. They drifted down like snow, disappearing into the gentle swells. Some caught the breeze, creating momentary patterns in the air before settling on the water's surface. Neither sister spoke. There were no words adequate for this moment, this final return. Alma reached into her dress pocket again, this time withdrawing 2 white rose petals. They were perfect and unblemished, carefully chosen from the monastery's garden that morning. One for each life lost and reclaimed. Their mother, who had died bringing them into the world, and their father, who had lived 2 decades believing he had lost everything. She released the petals over the dissolving ashes. They floated on the surface, turning slowly like tiny boats, before being carried away by the current. The sisters joined hands, their fingers interlocking in the familiar way they had since childhood. In their silence was every unsaid word, every complex emotion, every step of their journey from abandoned infants to the women they had become. The captain waited patiently, understanding the sanctity of the moment. Only when Ruth finally nodded did he slowly turn the boat toward shore. As they approached the coast, the monastery grew larger against the backdrop of Sicily's rugged landscape. Its ancient stones glowed warm in the afternoon light, welcoming them home. They made their way up the beach barefoot, shoes dangling from their hands, letting the sand work between their toes. The familiar path to the monastery gates hadn't changed. The same worn stones, the same twisted olive trees, the same salt-weathered walls that had sheltered them for so many years. Mother Silvana waited at the gates, her once straight posture now bent with age. Her habit was as crisp as ever, but her hands showed the tremors of time as she gripped the iron bars for support. Her eyes, though, remained sharp and clear, taking in every detail of the women approaching her. Ruth moved ahead of Alma, her steps purposeful but gentle. When she reached Silvana, she lowered herself to her knees, not in submission, but in profound respect for the woman who had given them life when the sea had tried to claim it. From her bag, Ruth withdrew a leather folder, its contents representing both an ending and a beginning. She placed it carefully in Silvana's lap, the legal documents confirming the monastery's full funding from the Gable estate. Months of work had gone into ensuring the transfer was complete and uncontestable. The papers guaranteed that the sanctuary that had saved them would continue saving others for generations to come. Silvana's weathered hands traced the folder's edges. Her eyes grew wet as she understood the magnitude of what she held. "He finally did something right," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades of protection and sacrifice. In the distance, the monastery bells began to ring, their familiar tones floating out over the water. The sound wrapped around them like an embrace, marking time as it had always done, through storms and sunshine, through loss and redemption, through endings and beginnings. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Alma's seaside hospice, casting warm patterns across the pale blue walls. The converted villa, just outside Palermo, breathed with a gentle rhythm all its own. Sea breezes carried the scent of salt and jasmine through open windows, stirring the light curtains like dancing ghosts. Alma moved quietly through the corridors, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the terracotta tiles. The hospice was everything she had dreamed of creating, not a place of endings, but a space where peace could find root in the hardest soil. The walls, painted in soothing blues and creams, reminded her patients of the ocean that stretched endlessly beyond their windows. In the garden, elderly patients sat in comfortable chairs arranged in small circles. Some dozed in the warmth, while others chatted softly or worked on puzzles. Potted herbs lined the pathways, rosemary, basil, and lavender, their fragrances mixing with the sea air. A retired fisherman named Marco was telling stories to anyone who would listen, his weathered hands moving through the air as he described the greatest catch of his life. The morning rounds were Alma's favorite part of the day. She knew each patient's story, their fears, their small victories. She had learned from her time with Lawrence that healing wasn't always about the body. Sometimes it was about making peace with the tide that carried everyone, eventually, to the same shore. Pausing at the bed of Mrs. Conti, an elderly writer with failing kidneys, Alma checked the IV drip with practiced care. Without thinking, she began to hum the old monastery lullaby, the same one that had soothed her and Ruth through countless nights, the same one she had hummed to her father in his final hours. Mrs. Conti's eyes fluttered open. "That song," she whispered, her voice thin but clear, "sounds like forgiveness." She reached for Alma's hand, squeezing it gently, like waves washing everything clean. Alma smiled, touched by the simple truth in those words. She adjusted Mrs. Conti's pillow and made sure her water was within reach before moving on to her next patient. Across town, in a converted warehouse that now housed the Salt and Grace Initiative's legal aid clinic, Ruth stood before a crowd of community leaders and volunteers. Sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating the determination in her face as she spoke about their mission. "We were all children once," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Some of us were lost, some abandoned, some stolen, but every child deserves to be found, to be protected, to be given a chance to write their own story." The initiative had grown beyond her wildest dreams. What had started as a small legal defense fund now served immigrant children, abandoned minors, and survivors of human trafficking. The walls of the clinic were covered with artwork from the children they'd helped, bright drawings of houses, families, and futures reclaimed. After the speech, Ruth made her way to the familiar bench by the shore where she and Alma often met. The wood was worn smooth by salt air and countless visitors, but it remained sturdy, like so many things that endured the sea's constant presence. Alma was already waiting, 2 cups of gelato in hand. She passed one to Ruth, lemon for her sister, pistachio for herself. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll in. Their lockets caught the afternoon light, matching pendants that had survived storm and separation to bring them full circle. A child's laughter cut through the air as a young boy chased a red ball along the beach. The ball rolled toward them, and Ruth smoothly stopped it with her foot. She picked it up, sand falling from its surface, and held it out to the approaching child with a smile that transformed her entire face. The boy grinned, grabbed the ball, and ran back to his waiting family. Alma watched her sister, noting how the rigid set of her shoulders had softened over the past year, how anger had given way to something deeper and more peaceful. "You look like someone who finally let go," Alma said softly, licking a drop of gelato from her spoon. Ruth didn't respond immediately, but her expression was thoughtful rather than guarded. The constant storm that had driven her for so long had calmed, leaving behind a strength that no longer needed to prove itself. Their gelato finished, they stood and walked toward the water's edge. The tide was coming in, gentle waves reaching further up the sand with each pulse. They removed their shoes, letting the cool water lap around their ankles. The sensation was familiar. They had done this countless times as children at the monastery, imagining their mother's spirit in every wave that touched their feet. The water swirled around them, erasing their footprints almost as quickly as they made them. Ruth's hand found Alma's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. The sea stretched before them, endless and eternal. The same water that had once carried them as infants, that had returned them to life, that had accepted their father's ashes. "We were never lost," Ruth said, her voice barely louder than the waves. "Just waiting to come back." Hand in hand, they stepped forward into the gentle surf, the water rising around their ankles as the tide continued its ancient dance. The waves lapped at their feet, constant and rhythmic, like a lullaby sung in the language of the sea. If you enjoyed the story of Alma and Ruth, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.